All right, today we're going to be reading some of the absolute worst takes that we've heard so far on Trump's war in Iran. Now, this was a difficult contest for me to figure out what I wanted to actually read because the takes have just been so bad. So let me bring some of them up and let's take a look. Fix my audio here. All right, we are starting with everybody's favorite, The Atlantic. Now, longtime readers will know that I have a special ire for the Atlantic because it is, let's put it lightly, a reactionary magazine that tries to sell conservative ideas to disaffected liberals. Now, this article first came to my attention with a tweet from The Atlantic, which reads, Benjamin Netanyahu's long career was built on conflict avoidance. Then October 7th transformed and radicalized him. Now, you have to be willfully naive to think that Benjamin Netanyahu was conflict avoidant before October 7th. Netanyahu has long been one of the most hawkish, militant people in the Israeli government, and that's saying something. So let's dive into this. The Israel of October 6th is never coming back. The October 7th massacre transformed and radicalized Benjamin Netanyahu and the country he governs. Calling him radicalized is a lot like saying Donald Trump was radicalized, right? These are far-right men who have had far-right politics for decades. What we are seeing now and why this article is being written is that public support in the United States for Israel is cratering. No one under 40 likes Israel, no matter they're Democrats, Republicans, independents, whatever it may be. This is an attempt to put the blame for that disapproval of Israel, which comes from dissatisfaction with Israel's actions, onto the Palestinian people. Before I begin, Yair Rosenberg, super reactionary guy. He wrote a lot for Tablet magazine, which is basically like the Likud party's outlet in the United States of America. So right-wing Jewish Zionist magazine that, always argues against rights and respect for the Palestinian people. Just about the only thing that the administrations of Barack Obama and Donald Trump have agreed on is that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was too timid to pull the trigger. The thing about Bibi is he's chicken shit, a senior Obama official told The Atlantic's Jeffrey Goldberg in 2014, explaining that the Israeli leader was scared to launch wars. 9 years later, Trump would tell attendees at a campaign rally that Netanyahu had initially committed to join America's 2020 strike on Qasem Soleimani, the notorious head of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard, but backed out at the last minute. I'll never forget that Bibi let us down, Trump told his supporters at a gathering just days after the Hamas massacre in 2023. That was then. Such assessments of Netanyahu sound absurd today as Israel wages war on Iran for the second time, having dismantled the regime's proxy armies, Hamas and Hezbollah, and assassinated its supreme leader. But in fact, Netanyahu's American critics accurately characterized his conduct until October 7th, 2023. For years, the Israeli leader spoke loudly and carried a small stick. Despite delivering numerous warnings about Iran's nuclear ambitions in Israel, the U.S. Congress, and the United Nations, Netanyahu never backed up his bellicose rhetoric with on-the-ground action. That is, until 2024. The Netanyahu who is currently commanding a high-risk assault on Tehran is not the same Netanyahu who governed Israel for nearly 2 decades prior, and the country he leads is not the same either. Okay, so what are we seeing here? We're seeing right here that the country of Israel, which, the Israeli public broadly supports Netanyahu, the genocide of Gaza, and the war in Iran, that they were just so transformed by October 7th. That's not the case, right? This is a lot of bullshit. And this is something that reactionaries like to do, especially in the Atlantic, right? Is say Barack Obama and Donald Trump agreed that Benjamin Netanyahu wasn't a war hawk. He's too chicken shit to launch wars. Therefore, obviously, this is unanimously agreed. It's especially telling that they link to this Atlantic article by Jeffrey Goldberg, which I can bring up here for you folks. Right. So this is Jeffrey Goldberg, the current Atlantic editor in chief. And this is where the quote that Netanyahu is too chicken shit comes from. Right. And what this is about, and I need to come up with a name for this because I see the New York Times and the Atlantic do this a lot where they say, oh, make a claim and then the evidence is linked to something else. But if you actually click into the evidence, into the link, that's not what that piece says, right? This is about the tension between the Obama and Netanyahu administrations, where for a lot, Obama was pissed off that Netanyahu was too belligerent, right? In here, and this is what Yair Rosenberg links as proof that Netanyahu was not a warmonger, is that he was ruining John Kerry's peace process by, up here, I think it is, by expanding the settlements, right? This is what this piece actually said. Obama administration officials express, in the words of one official, a red-hot anger at Netanyahu for pursuing settlement policies on the West Bank, building policies in Jerusalem, which is supposed to be a jointly shared city between the Palestinians and the Israelis. But much like the West Bank, the Israelis, control it through military occupation, allow Zionists to build there, but prevent Palestinians from building there. And that they believe he has fatally undermined Secretary of State's John Kerry's peace process. So what this is saying is that the Obama administration thought that Netanyahu was too belligerent for their taste, right? And now we can get into the details here about Netanyahu is too chicken shit to launch an actual war. But as we'll see, what Netanyahu really wants to do is use American troops for the war, right? That is what has been his strategy. You play up the American-Israeli special relationship, and then you get the American troops to fight for Israel. Basically, this was his strategy in 2003 in the lead up to the Iraq War, where he came to Congress, said, Iraq, huge threat to the Middle East, huge threat to Israel. They have a nuclear weapon, and then got the Americans to invade. I shouldn't put this all on Israel because, a lot of Americans just wanted to invade Iraq for their own purpose, and then sent no Israeli troops to fight in Iraq, right? So when we're saying he hasn't, he hasn't been a warmonger, he has against the Palestinians, and the term war is being misappropriately used here because war typically means fighting between two different nation states. The Palestinians don't have their own state. And then two, he has gotten American soldiers to fight on his behalf. So we're going to see this, right? Before this seismic shift, Netanyahu's longevity as prime minister was built on a foundation of conflict avoidance. That posture appealed to a risk-averse electorate. Under his premiership, Israeli voters who were comfortable with the status quo could rest easy knowing that their leader would be unlikely to upset it. Despite his image, Netanyahu is not a warmonger. One of the prime minister's left-wing critics and his biographer wrote in 2018. We often talk about how the Democratic and Republican parties are very similar in the United States, and they are. But what you have to understand is as much as Democrats and Republicans have 80 to 90% overlap on foreign policy, Israeli parties are lockstep, right? I remember, I think it was during the 2018 elections, maybe. This man, Naftali Bennett, was leading the blue and white coalition against Netanyahu. And he ran against Netanyahu supposedly from the left by airing ads about how many Palestinians he had killed when he was a military commander, right? So this man was saying Netanyahu is corrupt, he's undemocratic, all that is true, but I have been tougher on the Palestinians than Netanyahu. So to say he's not a warmonger, and then we also see this is his left-wing critic and his biographer, right? So we see how close these parties actually are. Averse to making war or peace. At this time, Pfeiffer correctly predicted that Israel would not go to war with Iran despite having a sympathetic Trump administration by its side. Netanyahu, I actually want to call this out because this is what they talked about up here, right? Trump saying, oh yeah, Bibi Netanyahu chickened out after getting the Americans to assassinate Qasem Soleimani on an Iraqi airport while he was traveling under a diplomatic passport. Netanyahu didn't chicken out, right? He got the Americans to assassinate an Iranian general. So when we're down here saying at this time, he correctly predicted that Israel would not go to war with Iran. Yeah, they didn't have to go to war with Iran because he tricked the Americans into doing it for him. Netanyahu was cautious by temperament and also by experience. His older brother, Yanni, was killed in a hostage rescue raid in 1976. As a leader of parliamentary opposition, Netanyahu saw a ruinous war in Lebanon destroy the standing of Ehud Olmert, his center-left predecessor as prime minister. A smooth-talking master of image management, Netanyahu understood that wars are hard to predict and impossible to script. Rather than tackle Tehran head-on, he moved the fight into the shadows, championing global sanctions in public while quietly unleashing a covert campaign to sabotage Iran's nuclear program from within. The kind of background to all of this is that the Israeli public is extremely sensitive to Israeli soldiers being taken prisoner or killed, right? They don't like it. This is one of the reasons why Israel has what we know as the Hannibal Protocol, which they issued on October 7th, which says if a Israeli is being taken prisoner by militants, it is better to kill the soldier than it is to let them be taken prisoner, right? Because what Palestinian militants have done is used those prisoners of war and traded one Israeli for, up to hundreds of Palestinian hostages held in Israeli jails. So because the public is so sensitive to casualties, Netanyahu doesn't like to piss them off, right? So he has developed a strategy of targeting Israel's opponents, in this case, Iran, through basically American pressure, right? When we say covert campaign to sabotage Iran's nuclear program from within, we're talking a lot about the CIA. With sanctions, championing global sanctions, right? That is essentially the American Treasury stepping in and saying, we're sanctioning Iran. Because, countries can sanction each other all the time. But the truth about sanctions is that because America is the global financial capital of the world, if we say, hey, you do business with Iran, you can't do business in America, pretty much every banker, country, foreign government, right, is going to choose us over Iran. Now, if Israel said you can either do business with Iran or with us, some people would say, hey, actually, it's better for our business to do business in that country, right? So he's getting American power to, of course, replace the need for Israel to actually fight its wars. This preference for containment over open conflict was applied not just to Iran, but also another territory next door. For years, Netanyahu resisted agitation with his own right-wing government to invade Gaza and topple its terrorist rulers. That's the Atlantic for you. In his 2022 memoir, Netanyahu wrote proudly about rejecting these calls to arms. Ending these kinds of operations is much harder than starting them, he noted. The public invariably expects the government to continue the battle and flatten Gaza, believing that with enough punishment, the Hamas regime would collapse. Yet that would only happen if we sent in the army. The casualties would mount, many hundreds on the Israeli side and many thousands on the Palestinian side. Did I really want to tie down the IDF in Gaza for years when we had to deal with Iran and a possible Syrian front? The answer was categorically no. Instead, Netanyahu opted to degrade Hamas with limited air commands and then attempted to buy quiet by funneling the group millions of dollars from Qatar. Okay, so here's what I was talking about, right? The casualties would mount, many hundreds on the Israeli side. He did not want the bad political press of losses. And the important thing to remember is that Israel has a parliamentary system, right? So they have scheduled elections for October. But at any point, the Knesset, which is the Israeli parliament, can vote to dissolve itself. So if Netanyahu launches a invasion of Gaza and 100 Israeli troops are killed, the Knesset, which is, these parliamentary systems are more responsive to democratic wills than the American system, can say, hey, we no longer support Netanyahu as prime minister. We're going to vote to dissolve ourselves and call new elections. So there's actually like a more democratic lever for places like Israel. Of course, when we're talking about Israel, we need to be clear that it's not actually a democracy, because they really only let the citizens of Israel vote, while making sure that Palestinians living under their military occupation are deprived of that right. This is where we see just straight up propaganda, right? Netanyahu opted to degrade Hamas with limited air campaigns, and then attempted to buy quiet by funneling the group with millions of dollars from Qatar. You can't say that he is not a warmonger and then say limited air campaigns. What this was, which is Zionists called the strategy of mowing the lawn, right? They let Palestinian militants, in this case Hamas, get to a certain level of belligerency so that they can come in with an airstrike and say to their voters, hey, we did it. We fought Hamas. We killed all of them, stuff like that. He did not try and buy quiet by funneling the group with millions of dollars. What Benjamin Netanyahu was explicit about was that he wanted to increase the power of Hamas in Gaza as a counterweight to the Palestinian Authority, which rules the West Bank. And now these groups have gone kind of back and forth, right? I believe in the 2007 elections, Hamas won over Fatah, which was linked with the Palestinian Authority. It was kind of like the Palestinian Authority's sister group in the Gaza Strip, as opposed to the West Bank, which of course are divided. And so I wanted to bring up this, and this was written the day after October 7th. Let me see here. And this is the Times of Israel. Okay, so this is like, I would say the Jerusalem Post is kind of the equivalent of like our Wall Street Journal in America. The Times of Israel makes me think about like Breitbart, right? This is a very right-wing group. And after October 7th, Israeli society was very mad at Benjamin Netanyahu for letting this happen. He had actually moved Israeli army forces from Gaza to the West Bank to protect settlers, because he was and still is in a coalition with the Religious Zionist Party, which is Smotrich's party, right? As fanatical as Benjamin Netanyahu is, the Religious Zionists are, to his right. I'm not going to read this whole thing, but basically what this outlines is that Netanyahu, under his prime ministership, actually in both of them, I believe, was enabling Hamas, right? He was empowering Hamas in Gaza, because what he did not want was the Palestinian Authority governing the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and then saying, okay, we need this push for a two-state solution. Because Hamas, and this is common in any sort of situation with paramilitaries and sectarian struggle, they actually fought the Palestinian Authority, which, not to go too deep, the Palestinian Authority is the former PLO, Palestinian Liberation Organization. So he wanted to empower Hamas, specifically divide the Palestinian cause, and then use that as a wedge to make sure that there was no Palestinian state. Am I sharing the right screen? I am, right? Yeah, right. So like right here, this is how he was channeling work permits to Hamas. He was physically working with Hamas, saying, I will give you these amount of work permits for Gazans to come work in Israel proper, so that the economy stays up, your people have some food, and of course, they are more supportive of Hamas than they are of the Palestinian Authority. Right, so let's see. Yeah, so he was issuing about 2,000 to 3,000 work permits for Gazans at the end of 2021. And then by the end of 2023, this soared to 20,000. And let's be clear, Benjamin Netanyahu does not care about Gazans, getting work and jobs and stuff like that. Let's see. Here's where we get to the Qataris, right? So the Qataris give money to the Palestinians, right? Meanwhile, Israel has allowed suitcases holding millions in Qatari cash to enter Gaza through its crossing since 28 in order to maintain its fragile ceasefire with Hamas rulers of the Strip. Most of the time, Israeli policy was to treat the Palestinian Authority as a burden and Hamas as an asset. Far right, I can't pronounce his first name, but Smotrich, now the finance minister in the hardline government and leader of the religious Zionism party, said so himself in 2015, right? And here's where Netanyahu said this at a Likud party meeting, where he was quoted as saying that those who oppose a Palestinian state should support the transfer of funds to Gaza, Hamas, because maintaining the separation between the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and Hamas in Gaza would prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state. Again, this is reported in right-wing Israeli press as something that Benjamin Netanyahu said himself. So going back to our Atlantic article where, Yair Rosenberg is trying to say, oh, well, like Benjamin Netanyahu, he was just trying to buy peace, right? He's just a peaceful guy. Let's bring this back up. That's not true, right? This has always been Benjamin Netanyahu not wanting to lose power by waging wars and trying to find other ways to prevent a Palestinian state, an effective Palestinian resistance, and of course, achieve the Zionist goal of Greater Israel. The Hamas massacre of October 7th, whose atrocities were broadcast online by its perpetrators and seared into the Israeli consciousness, upended and discredited this approach. With Israel's borderlands in ruins and hundreds of its citizens taken hostage, the country's voters could no longer countenance their leaders' quietism, which now looked like a historical blunder. It was a blunder from the Israeli point of view for Netanyahu to look away from Gaza and towards the West Bank, but that's only if you're looking at it from the Zionist side. An Israeli public that had elected Netanyahu to steward its security now felt profoundly insecure and demanded dramatic action. To respond to the attack was not enough. The government needed to ensure that others like it would not happen by confronting threats at their source. He's basically saying Israel's hand was forced. They had to flatten Gaza, right? And this is the justification for every genocide. This is what the American government said about the indigenous people. This is what the British said about the Irish. This is what the British said about the Indians. This is what the British said about the Palestinians. Through line of history is Britain has done genocides, right? But also, this is what the Turks said about the Armenians. We have to do it to them before they do it to us. That is not how basic human dignity works, and that is not also how the laws of international warfare work. Netanyahu not sent Israeli ground troops into Gaza since 2014. After October 7th, that hesitation was no longer viable. He initiated the very campaign in Gaza that he had warned against. The cataclysmic and often chaotic conflict cost more Israeli and Palestinian lives than any war in their history, destroyed wide swaths of the enclave, empowered Israel's extremists who sought to settle the territory, and sharply eroded Israel's international standing. Again, blaming the Palestinians. Israeli society chose to conduct this genocide. The Israeli people could have stopped it by protesting their government and, like I said, getting their government to call what we know as a snap election. They didn't do that. They were angry with Netanyahu, but if you look at public polling, which I've written about in the past, they were extremely supportive of this military operation. To say that this empowered Israel's extremists who sought to settle the territory is so disingenuous. Ben-Gvir and Smotrich are in the government. Benjamin Netanyahu has a coalition government with the most far-right Israeli extremists. And I hear this all the time where they say, like, oh, Smotrich, Ben-Gvir, those are just two guys. They're not. If those parties no longer see their values reflected in Benjamin Netanyahu's prime ministership, they will pull out, and that will trigger an election, right? So to say that this empowered Israel's extremists is not true, because one thing I really want to get across is, like, we're talking about this like, oh, he only now announced an official war. Netanyahu has been extremely aggressive against the Palestinian people. And one thing he did was that he took the permitting ability for the West Bank, which is, to brush through this, right? Building permits are a very sensitive topic in the West Bank because they're how Israel builds their settlements, which is the vanguard of their colonization, right? They give building permits to Jewish Israelis, but not to Palestinians. And this is one way that, Zionists can build up their infrastructure and their presence and colonize the land. Netanyahu took that ability away from the Minister of Defense and gave it to Smotrich, who is technically the Minister of Finance, I believe, right? So he just needed to get Smotrich into his government, and Smotrich is very dedicated to colonizing the entire West Bank. And so he took that away from the defense minister and gave it to Smotrich, right? So Netanyahu has been empowering these extremists since 2022 at the latest when he did that. When his defense minister and other security officials pushed right after October 7th for Israel to strike not just Hamas, but also Hezbollah, Netanyahu demurred. The Lebanese militia was firing rockets into Israel at the time in solidarity with Hamas, but it was arguably the most fearsome non-state army in the world, and a shaken Netanyahu was not eager to take it on. This is not true. Israel had fights Hezbollah, launches missiles into Lebanon all the time. I don't even know how to say this. They started bombing Lebanon immediately. But as in Gaza, the Iranian proxy eventually forced Netanyahu's hand. Oh, can't blame Netanyahu. No, his hand was forced. He just, had to bomb 7 countries in 1 year and massacre 100,000 people. Hezbollah continued shelling Israel's north for more than 11 months, destroying towns and forcing the evacuation of nearly 70,000 Israelis. The devastation and displacement placed tremendous strain on Israel's internal cohesion and applied more and more pressure to its leaders. Finally, in September 2024, after months of tit-for-tat attacks, right? So here's what we're saying, right? Is that, he actually didn't fight Lebanon. He didn't fight Hezbollah. But actually, it had been months of tit-for-tat attacks. So he's saying in one paragraph, Netanyahu refused to engage with Hezbollah. The next paragraph down, well, he was bombing them, but not really, Netanyahu launched a full-fledged campaign against Hezbollah, complete with exploding beepers and bunker-busting bombs. And then something unexpected happened. Everything went according to plan. The exploding beepers thing, others have talked about that, but that was one of the most heinous war crimes I've ever seen, because, of course, putting bombs and beepers are indiscriminate, which is just dreadful. Hezbollah's leader, Hassan Nasrallah, was assassinated along with nearly its entire chain of command. Hezbollah was decimated and soon compelled to sign a ceasefire agreement on Israel's terms. Stripped of its enforcers, Syria's pro-Iran dictator, Bashar al-Assad, soon fell as well. Total war turned into nearly total victory. And at the same time, another parallel engagement further emboldened Netanyahu. In response to Israel's bombing of consular annex in Syria and the subsequent killing of Nasrallah, Iran launched waves of missiles and drones at Israel by the hundreds, the largest such assault in history. But Israel not only readily repelled nearly all of the projectiles, it also responded by easily penetrating and disabling some of Iran's most sensitive air defenses. So this is one of those things where this gets summed up in a single sentence right here. This was a huge story. What Israel did was they bombed Iran's essentially embassy in Syria. That is a war crime. That is, even nations where in some cases they are at war with each other, they choose not to attack each other's embassies, right? You're not supposed to strike diplomatic targets simply because countries, especially when they're at war, need to talk to each other. So bombing an Iranian embassy in Syria was one of the most, I shouldn't say one of the most aggressive because they were killing Palestinians all throughout, but this was such a huge escalation to be Iran launched waves of missiles and drones at Israel by the hundreds, the largest assault in history. Yeah, that is what happens when you go to war with somebody. If Canada started bombing U.S. consulates around the world, the United States would launch missiles at Canada. It's always framed like Iran is the aggressor, right? That's not what happened here. With each successful escalation, Netanyahu's willingness to use force to settle Israel's scores increased. The growing confidence culminated in the 12-day war last June, in which Israel achieved air dominance over Iran, bombed its nuclear sites, and took out much of the country's military and intelligence leadership, all without losing a single soldier. At the outset, Israel's military planners had projected more than 400 casualties on the home front from Iranian ballistic and drone attacks. In the end, there were only 28. Critics of Israel often rightly point out that Palestinian radicalization is less the result of ideology than of continuous Israeli occupation, violence, and dispossession. But this logic runs both ways. Netanyahu and the Israeli people would never have countenanced such extreme military actions if they had not experienced the one second there. We're good. The unspeakable horrors of October 7th and the repeating, unrelenting assault of Hezbollah's rockets and Iran's missiles. Okay. This is where we see why this piece was written, right? To say that the Palestinian and Israeli situations are the same is a lie. This is what I really hate about the narrative of how this, let's call it a conflict, is circular violence, right? Oh, we all start fighting. We can't remember where it started, who struck first. We're all revenging back and forth. This is not true. The Israeli people are the aggressor. They continue expanding settlements in the West Bank. The Oslo Accord was supposed to put a stop to that. Yasser Arafat and the PLO, now the Palestinian Authority, recognized the right of Israel to exist. They came to other agreements about shared territory, and settlements were supposed to stop. The Israelis never stopped the settlements. So we can do this, it goes all the way back to 1948, which, of course, the Israelis were the aggressors there. In the modern era, we know who the aggressors were, right? They have only tightened control over the Gaza Strip since 2007 when Hamas won an election, which, as we talked about earlier, Netanyahu and the Likud party actively helped. So to say Netanyahu and the Israeli people would never have countenanced such extreme military actions if they had not experienced the unspeakable horrors of October 7th is just absolute hasbara, right? This is Israeli propaganda. This is not how this situation works. This is not how colonization works, right? This is like saying, okay, Jim would not have ever hit his wife hard had she not defended herself the first time Jim hit her, right? I hope that analogy tracks because it's so like mind-bogglingly dumb that I have to, stretch to find something. I also want to point out, they say a lot like Hezbollah's rockets. Hezbollah formed in 1985. Israel invaded Lebanon in 1982. Hezbollah formed because when Israel invaded Lebanon to push out the PLO, which was staying there, they created a war zone, right? And so all these Shia militias came together and they formed Hezbollah to defend against Israel. That is why Hezbollah still exists. If Israel stopped attacking nations, specifically Lebanon, Hezbollah would likely disappear overnight because it would have no purpose, right? And so to say like, oh, it's the unrelenting assaults of Hezbollah's rockets that is forcing the Israeli people to do this is just not true, right? We have a clear cause and effect. Israel invaded and then Hezbollah formed. So this cycle has reached its zenith in Netanyahu's latest and greatest gambles. Casting off his cautiousness, he has bet his political future in the countries on Israel's ability to confront not only Iranian regime, but also its Hezbollah and Houthi allies, all while managing a mercurial Trump who remains liable to declare a premature victory and exit the stage at any moment. Whether this gambit will succeed is unclear, and one should distrust anyone who suggests otherwise. But what is clear is that the Israel and Netanyahu of October 6, 2023 are never coming back. The Israel of October 6, 2023 is the same Israel that existed on October 8th, 2023. The policies, racism, and apartheid nature of this state did not appear on October 7th. They were there before. People can, argue about the legitimacy of October 7th operations and stuff like that. I have covered extensively all the propaganda that went into, dehumanizing the Palestinian people after that. But to say that this was a dividing point is to misrepresent what Israel is. Israel has always been and will always be a Jewish supremacist settler colonial nation. That is what it was explicitly designed to do. That is what it is doing now. There, of course, was an escalation after October 7th, but that is because the settlers thought that they had the opportunity, they had the public goodwill to go ahead and finally do what they had been talking about doing for close to a century, annihilating the Palestinian people. And so stuff like this, written by Yair at a magazine that is owned by a Zionist billionaire, which is run by Jeffrey Goldberg, who dropped out of college to go volunteer for the IDF at a prison that was subsequently shut down for human rights violations. They are running things like this because they know that what Netanyahu and Israel have done is reveal the country's true intention. And they know that the clock is ticking for Israel because young people in America, and actually a lot of old people, don't want to support this anymore. And so they have to bide Israel enough goodwill to get them through 2-3 more elections so that they can do in the West Bank what they have done in Gaza, because that will be the final form of the Zionist goal. So that is what the Atlantic said about this war. Let's see what the New York Times had. All right, I had a couple. This is actually kind of weird because someone wrote like the exact same thing about Trump, right? We'll get to Brett Stevens in a second. I know I talked about him, but this is a very similar article to the one we just read. The last one was like, hey, Benjamin Netanyahu, the people of Israel, they didn't want war. They've tried to avoid war. Look at what the Palestinians made them do. This is the same thing. The one thing I will say is, like we talked about with the Clinton testimony a few weeks ago, this is in the news analysis section. So if we have time, we can go through Brett Stevens' op-ed, which is terrible. But this is what the New York Times is presenting to its readers as objective, unbiased statement of facts. Trump embraces U.S. military power after years of caution. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq offered a stark lesson in the limits of military force. The Iran attack suggests an era of post-war wariness is over. I want you to think about which words you would use to describe Donald Trump. And I want you to, in your mind, think, where would the word cautious be in that list? To say Trump is a cautious man is absurd. To say he has been using years of caution about U.S. military power, I almost think that like the New York Times is just fucking with us at this point. Like they're just like, hey, our publication, we're funded by Wordle. Our cooking section brings in all the money. Let's just like see how crazy we can get with this new thing. Because to say that he has been reserved or cautious is like, I think in a lot of ways, maybe more outlandish than saying Netanyahu was conflict avoidant, because his entire thing has been championing the American war machine for, at this point, over a decade since he got into American politics. Again, this is news analysis. In his 3 runs for the presidency, Donald J. Trump, more than any other candidate, spoke of the limits of U.S. military power, especially in the Middle East. Not true. You can say that I would say in the 2024 election, he smartly ran against Kamala Harris and Joe Biden's support for the Israeli genocide. Of course, we all knew that he had no interest in stopping that genocide. He was just saying stuff to get people to dislike the Democrats. In his 2016 primary, these were not my politicians, but Rand Paul was very outspoken against the U.S. military war machine, and Donald Trump attacked him for it. Bernie Sanders, in both of these presidential contests, was more outspoken against the US war machine. And, you know, Donald Trump was far to his right. I would also say, and I'd have to go back and see what was actually said, but in 2020, Trump ran against Joe Biden and he lost. And now I'm very critical of Joe Biden for his foreign policy. But one thing he did, which I loved, was withdraw American troops from Afghanistan. Donald Trump was president and he did not do that. So if we're saying he spoke of the limits of US military power, maybe we could say this is technically true, but Greg here is deceiving his readers, right? Because Donald Trump loved American military power. He bragged about it. He got off on it. And he repeatedly used it for ways we'll cover in a second, in ways that his successors did not. In 2016, he blasted the Iraq invasion as a big fat mistake. In 2023, he kicked off his third run for the White House by boasting, "I am proud to be the only president in decades who did not start a new war." This is, again, much like Netanyahu, it's like, okay, what do we mean when we say war? Everybody forgets this, but Donald Trump was actually the president who got America involved in the Russia-Ukraine war. In my opinion, Barack Obama was correct to say to Ukraine, we will provide you medical assistance, but we're not going to give you wars. And Obama was wary that this would become another Afghanistan. We'd get dragged in, and then specifically Afghanistan in the 1990s, where we flood a volatile area with weapons. And once the war is over, you have a bunch of fanatics with weapons, right? And this is kind of what happened in Afghanistan, that the Mujahideen had all these guns. Afghanistan had a civil war immediately after the Soviets left in the 90s. And the winner of that was what we know as the Taliban, right? Same thing with Ukraine. And I know we're not talking about Ukraine right now, but it is important to remember with Ukraine that I'm going to call them neo-Nazi militias, have been very open that after they defeat the Russian invaders, they plan to go and fight, quote unquote, the Jewish government in Kiev, right? Specifically Zelensky, right? So in my opinion, I think this is a nuanced discussion that we're not going to talk about today. But, there was good reason for Obama to be like, hey, maybe I'm not going to flood this place with Javelin missiles. Donald Trump did that. Donald Trump was the president who sent American weapons into Ukraine in 2018. Now, does that count as starting a new war? Everybody's going to have a different definition of war. But to say that he was just, kind of a dove, a really cautious man during his first term is just incorrect. Mr. Trump was channeling a deep and widespread pessimism that dominated the Pentagon and the foreign policy establishment in the years after Iraq and Afghanistan wars. The hopelessness ran through both political parties. In Iraq, the U.S. intervened and occupied, and the result was a costly disaster. A top foreign policy advisor to the Obama White House famously wrote in 2015, in Libya, the U.S. intervened and did not occupy, and the result was a costly disaster. In Syria, the U.S. neither intervened nor occupied, and the result is a costly disaster. Again, this is not true. U.S. forces have been in Syria since the start of the Syrian civil war, and our number one guy, the new Syrian president, was, in my opinion, very clearly a CIA asset who set up al-Nusra Front, which was a kind of joint Al-Qaeda ISIS operation, which was openly supported by Israel fighting Bashar al-Assad. So to say we neither intervened nor occupied is not true. We didn't occupy. We definitely intervened. But it was Mr. Trump who transformed the frustrations into a popular political movement. 1 year into his second term, Mr. Trump seems to have shed his earlier skepticism and turned repeatedly to the U.S. military as a low-cost, high-payoff means of solving problems that have bedeviled American presidents for decades. In June, he dispatched B-2 bombers on a mission to strike Iran's nuclear facilities. So far this year, he has given the green light to a high-stakes raid that resulted in the capture of President Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela. No nation in the world could achieve what America has achieved, Mr. Trump said hours after the operation. Then he signed off on a major U.S.-Israeli attack that killed Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, Iran's supreme leader. Mr. Trump said on social media that the attacks would continue throughout the week or as long as necessary to achieve our objective of peace throughout the Middle East and indeed the world. The president's sudden embrace of U.S. military power is a stunning reversal. Democrats warned over the weekend that he was ignoring the lessons of the long and bloody wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. I'm going to read this again. The president's sudden embrace of U.S. military power is a stunning reversal. If, let's say, President Bernie Sanders was in office and he launched this attack on Iran, this war on Iran, I would call that a sudden embrace of U.S. military power in a stunning reversal. The only way you can think that this is a stunning reversal is if you take one of those Men in Black mind eraser things, and on January 21st, 2025, stick it right up to your eyeballs and forget everything Donald Trump, the former president, had done in his first term and Donald Trump, the candidate, had said for the past 6 years. This is not a stunning reversal. At the Republican National Convention, Donald Trump said he wanted to reinvade Afghanistan because Bagram Air Force Base would be a good place to bomb China. This is, you can argue, hey, maybe he played this lip service to, not get involved in Iraq and how that was bad. But if you actually believe that, you shouldn't have a job at the New York Times. You should, I don't know, trade places with me. The American people have seen this playbook before. Claims of urgency, misrepresented intelligence, and military action that pulls the United States into regime change and prolonged costly nation building. Senator Mark Warner of Virginia, the top Democrat on the Intelligence Committee, said. Good statement from Mark. And I also take issue with, Democrats warned over the weekend because Chuck Schumer has been supportive of, this operation, I would say. The attacks on Iran have also come at the cost of the United States. Retaliatory strikes have killed 6 U.S. troops, the military central command announced on Sunday. During the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, senior military officials repeatedly emphasized that the United States could not bomb or kill its way to victory. America's enemies would rearm and replace leaders lost to airstrikes and raid. Civilian casualties and inevitability in war would feed the enemy's ranks. This was not like what the military was saying during Iraq and Afghanistan. They paid lip service to this notion of nation building, but, military command was very forthright in its desire to wage wars. There was no hesitation from the U.S. military to, pull back the troops and focus on actually building a governing apparatus in Iraq and Afghanistan. This is this is like this person their foreign policy is based off of they went to a Top Gun movie marathon or something. And it's so wild how these guys have absolutely no shame in writing insane stuff like this. Mr. Trump appears convinced that he and his top advisors, including General Dan Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, have found a more effective way of wielding military might. Sure, buddy. In the days leading up to the Iran attack, General Kane emphasized that an operation aimed at toppling the government or debilitating the military would be much more difficult than the capture of Mr. Maduro or the strikes on Iran last summer. This feels right here like General Kane and his staff are leaking that they thought this was a bad idea. We have to remember, the military is not explicitly partisan, but they are political. They know how this looks. And there was a lot of leaks to the media before the invasion of top generals saying this was a bad idea, this wouldn't work, stuff like that. This is something, reading between the lines here, in the days leading up to the Iran attack, General Kane emphasized that an operation aimed at top, you would only know this if somebody from General Kane's camp was leaking to the media, which the military does a lot. And the media prints it verbatim because, I don't know, it makes them feel cool or something. Publicly, Mr. Trump played down the risk and insisted that General Kane believed any military incursion into Iran would be something easily won. So this is, I'm convinced this is him leaking, right? He's emphasizing that, this wasn't me, and Trump saying oh no, this guy said it would be easily won. So he went not on the record to the New York Times, but on background saying, hey, what Trump is saying about me isn't true. The president's string of relatively low-cost military successes in his second term seemed to have shifted his views on American military interventions. Trump, are these people out of their minds? Trump assassinated an Iranian general on an Iraqi airport while he was traveling under a diplomatic passport to deliver a message between Iran and Saudi Arabia on how to form a popular front to fight ISIS. That was like the Saudi Arabia Iran Cold War has been so destructive for the Middle East with our help. And Qasem Soleimani was going to meet in a neutral third party, Iraq, to talk about how they could defeat ISIS. And Trump blew him up and killed 4 Iraqi generals who were leading that front against ISIS. To say that he has shifted his views on military interventions is so fucking insane. He kept American forces in Afghanistan. You can, quabble about my definition of the Ukrainian American involvement in the Ukraine-Russian war, but he continued the American war in Afghanistan. He was not some anti-interventionist during his first term. He has accepted that the U.S. military is very good. Yeah, because Donald Trump was so against the U.S. military before. A senior analyst at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. This is like just a think tank of people who used to work at the Pentagon, by the way. He seems to believe that if you avoid major ground operations and keep it limited, it's probably going to work. In the aftermath of military defeat, senior uniformed leaders have often acted as a check on presidential ambitions. General Colin Powell, who was wounded in Vietnam and went on to serve as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, insisted that the U.S. military should be deployed only when vital American interests were at stake. The objectives were clear and an exit strategy had been defined. This became known as the Powell Doctrine. A decade later, Mr. Powell set aside his skepticism and made the case in a presentation to the UN Security Council for the 2003 invasion of Iraq, a decision he later came to regret. This is bullshit. This is just doing PR for Colin Powell's ghost. He went to the UN and he lied, knowing he was lying, that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, which was huge in getting international support. And to say that, he set aside his skepticism. No, he didn't. He lied. This is, man, and the New York Times wonders why people don't trust them. In Mr. Trump's first term, senior Pentagon leaders like Defense Secretary Jim Mattis and Joint Chiefs Chairman Mark A. Miley, who led troops in Iraq and Afghanistan, sought to temper his military instincts. The president came to loathe and distrust both of them. This is actually true. There were people who, in the military, like I said, the military is political. They were saying, no, let's, try and keep a lid on things. They clearly didn't do a good job because he, got us involved in Ukraine, blew up people in Iraq, and was actually very instrumental in escalating airstrikes throughout Somalia. So, take this with a grain of salt. In Mr. Trump's second term, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has fired or sidelined more than 24 generals whom he viewed as out of step with the president's policies and instincts regarding the employment of military force. The dismissals, which are without precedent in recent decades, have had a chilling effect on those who remain, military officials said. I want to call this out because we hear the term a lot, purge, when we talk about Saddam Hussein or even Xi Jinping in China has purged military officials recently. I should actually differentiate that because I'm pretty sure Saddam Hussein killed military officials he didn't like. But, I saw the New York Times reporting recently that the Chinese Communist Party purged generals who they thought were insufficiently dedicated to Xi's policy. This is a military purge. What they're describing right here is a military purge. They went through and they purged everyone who they thought would say something like, hey, maybe we shouldn't bomb people boating off of South America because that's fucking illegal and we'll go to hell. They purged people, which is why we're hearing less leaks and less opposition to Trump's military support. The other thing we should say is my personal belief on Pete Hegseth is a lot why I think Trump wanted, what was his name? Matt Gaetz to be attorney general. Gaetz was an open pedophile. He bragged about having sex with underage women to his friends in Congress. And Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, I believe, has 2 or 3 not open, sexual assault cases, accusations that are under NDA. And I believe Donald Trump has video evidence, something like that, blackmail of Pete Hegseth. And Hegseth does not need Trump's encouragement to start wars. I think he actually likes wars. But I think that hiring these guys, Trump likes to know, hey, I have some dirt on you. If you don't do what I say, maybe that video of you dragging an unconscious woman into her bedroom is going to end up in the New York Post. I think a lot about this, and what kind of really makes me believe this is what we have seen lately with Howard Lutnick, right? So if you're unfamiliar, Howard Lutnick is I believe the Commerce Secretary. Somebody can correct me in the chat if I'm wrong. And he came out in the Epstein files that he was vacationing with Jeffrey Epstein, stuff like that. Lutnick had said last fall, "Oh no, I never went to Epstein's island. I met him once, and he was so gross." Kind of throwing shade at Trump, who was in these pictures with Epstein, and kind of saying like, "I knew Epstein was a creep, but Trump didn't." And then when the DOJ had to release files, they released some involving Lutnick. Now, we know that they have kept certain files pertaining to Trump under wraps. They're trying to trickle them out one by one, right? They put those Lutnick files out to embarrass him. They also did it to Elon Musk, who fell out with Donald Trump. So I really think when we're saying like Pete Hegseth is purging everyone and doing everything Trump asks, kind of the background here is Hegseth is, there's some dark stuff out there on him. And I think Trump has it. Back to, the horrors that be. Mr. Trump's view on military force is not totally unconstrained. And both Iran and Venezuela is not totally unconstrained. It's not constrained. He has repeatedly ruled out large-scale deployments of ground forces that characterized the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. He actually hasn't. They've been talking a lot about maybe needing boots on the ground in Iran. Very weird. His approach to military powers, such as Russia and China, has been far more conciliatory than confrontational. Mr. Trump has also shown a willingness to pull the plug on military interventions, such as his campaign to reopen shipping in the Red Sea by bombing Houthi militants in Yemen into submission. He wanted to see results in 30 days of the initial strikes. When senior military leaders suggested it would take as long as 10 months to debilitate the Houthis' air defenses, Mr. Trump cut a deal with the militants rather than continuing the operations. The United States would halt the bombing campaign, and the militia would no longer target American ships. The Houthis did not commit to ending attacks on other vessels. To clarify, the Houthis were attacking Israeli and American vessels because Israel was engaging in a genocide, is engaging in genocide. And now we can take issue with this, but under international law, countries are supposed to do everything in their power to stop genocides. So when we're getting mad at the Houthis for attacking Israeli vessels, or in the previous article we read saying Hezbollah bombed Israel in solidarity with Hamas, what those are is Yemen and the paramilitary of Hezbollah actually living up to the genocide convention principles that the United States has signed. We are supposed to be doing everything in our power if there is reasonable suspicion that a nation is committing a genocide to stop them. We didn't do that. So to say that the Houthis are at blame here, they're actually one of the only nations doing the good things. I also want to talk about how this framing is, right? Mr. Trump has shown a willingness to pull the plug on military interventions. Now, reading this, you get the sense of okay, he's not afraid to stop the military. This is a very weird thing to Netanyahu should have been arrested for genocide. I absolutely agree, Margot. This is a very weird thing to celebrate Trump for, where it's like he started bombing a country and then he stopped. It's like, yeah, he should stop. You shouldn't be bombing people. Bombing them was the wrong thing in the first place. It's like, I don't know. Joe showed a willingness to stop drinking during work days. Okay, probably shouldn't have been doing that in the first place. I don't get credit for stopping doing something, inappropriate. He basically seemed to conclude that the costs, including the financial costs of continuing the operation, were too high, said Richard Fontaine, the chief executive officer of the Center for a New American Security. I mean, we've seen multiple times in this in this news analysis, how you know, New York Times reporters have national security think tanks on speed dial, right? Center for New American Security. What was the other one we saw? The Center for Strategic and International Studies. Basically, what you need to know about all these national security think tanks is people get out of politics, get out of the Pentagon, they go work at one of these things, and they write white papers about how the world is in danger unless the U.S. government buys $2 billion from Raytheon every month, right? So this is like, these are used to give justification to an argument for more militancy. This is, let's call it, the American military industrial complex working with the media right here in front of our eyes. Other presidents contemplating military action often leaned heavily on advisors to craft strategies that balance ends, ways and means to achieve a clearly defined conclusion. Today, Mr. Trump seems to be operating by instinct rather than any strict ideology or planning project. Today, as opposed to the Donald Trump who acted with strict ideology and planning. Again, I think they're fucking with us. He has been explicit that he will not allow American power or his own credibility to be undermined, says Andreessen, a former Middle East analyst at the Pentagon who is now with the American Jewish Committee, which supports Jewish causes around the world. When Iran continued using the nuclear negotiations to stall and play games, that was a serious miscalculation. The big question is whether Mr. Trump's approach, with its emphasis on continued coercion through air and missile strikes, will produce a more sustained peace than previous strategies did. His tactics are well suited to narrowly defined objectives. In Iran, Mr. Trump's goals are far more ambitious. What are his goals? We have not gotten any clear goals from this administration. We have seen reporters numerous times ask Marco Rubio, Pete Hegseth, what are the goals? What are they? If the New York Times is going to say his goals are far more ambitious, they should tell us what those goals are. There is nothing in this, again, news analysis that says what Trump's goals are. All this is pretending that, his attempt at regime change is some newfound approach. Trump has been wanting to do this stuff and bragging about trying to do this stuff for years. There was this like weird veneer of anti-war republicanism during the last campaign. And honestly, people should be embarrassed that they fell for that. And apparently the New York Times did, because they are just ignoring and rewriting history to make it look like he is, going back on his campaign promise. And there is a specific quality to American punditry that I notice where they need to make it seem like there is logic and reason and rationale behind the Republican movement. And I think they do that because if they just start, in my opinion, saying what is the truth, that America has an inappropriate relationship with Israel, in my opinion, a colonial relationship, where I think they're more similar to one country than actually two different ones, and that Trump is helping Israel, and also the United States is a giant war machine. That's what we've been built to do. That's what we've been built to do since 1945. That's why we have the largest army. That's why we have a larger military than the next, I believe, 11 countries combined, 9 of those being our allies. And that Trump is finally the president who is once again saying everything out loud, saying, why have we built this nuclear stockpile, all these B-2s? What have we been doing buying Raytheon missiles from if we're not going to use them? And he's getting more egregious as, he stacks his administration with people who are, of course, more loyal to him. And as his brain is deteriorating, which I think is something we can't ignore in this. And he's been openly saying stuff like, I want to go to heaven. And we have reporting today that troops, probably at Hegseth's discretion, officers were telling their troops that this war with Iran is part of the evangelical Armageddon prophecy, right? And the New York Times is running cover for this, saying Everything before this was totally principled. But the big question is whether Mr. Trump's approach, with its emphasis on continued coercion through airstrikes and missile strikes, will produce a more sustainable peace than previous strategies did. Trump has no interest in peace. If you think he does, I have to question your basic intellect rather than your, political analysis skill. So, I think that's where we'll finish up today. Thanks everybody for joining me on a Tuesday night. I'm going to do more of these. If you guys have a special time that you like, let me know. We didn't get to Brett Stevens today, so I'm actually going to drop a gift link to his article, which, to be honest, you don't need me to break it down and explain why it's insane. It's absolutely insane. I'm going to put that in the Joe Wrote subscriber chat. So if you are not part of that chat, then go ahead and join, because I'll share that there. And that's where you'll get more information about stuff like this. So thanks again, everybody, and have a good night.